Section 6 of Across Asia on a Bicycle. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Across Asia on a Bicycle by Thomas Allen. Through Persia to Samarkand, Part 2. Throughout our Asiatic tour, eggs were our chief means of subsistence, but pilau, or boiled rice flavored with grease, we found more practically used in Persia, like yoğurt in Turkey. This was prepared with chicken whenever it was possible to purchase a fowl, and then we would usually make the discovery that a Persian fowl was either wingless, legless, or otherwise defective after being prepared by a Persian fuzul, or foreigner's servant, who, it is said, shrinks from no baseness in order to eat. Though minus these particular appendages, it would invariably have a head, for the fanatical Shia frequently snatched a chicken out of our hands to prevent us from wringing or chopping its head off. Even after our meal was served, we would keep a sharp lookout upon the unblushing pilferers around us, who had called to pay their respects and to fill the room with clouds of smoke from their chibouks and gurgling kalyans. For a fanatical Shia will sometimes stick his dirty fingers into the dishes of an unbeliever, even though we may subsequently throw away the contaminated vessel. And this extreme fanaticism is to be found in a country noted for its extensive latitude of the profession of religious beliefs. A present from the village Khan was announced. In stepped two men bearing a huge tray filled with melons, apricots, sugar, rock candy, nuts, pistachios, etc., all of which we must, of course, turn over to the Khan keeper and his servants, and pay double their value to the bearers as a present. This polite method of extortion was followed the next morning by one of a bolder and more peremptory nature. Notwithstanding the feast of the night before at our expense, and in addition to furnishing us with bedclothes, which we really ought to have been paid to sleep in, our oily host now insisted upon 3 or 4 prices for his lodgings. We refused to pay him more than a certain sum, and started to vacate the premises. Thereupon he and his grown son caught hold of our bicycles. Remonstrances proving of no avail, and being unable to force our passage through the narrow doorway with the bicycle in our hands, we dropped them and grappled with our antagonists. A noisy scuffle and then a heavy fall ensued, but luckily we were both on the upper side. This unusual disturbance now brought out the inmates of the adjoining anderoon. In a moment there was a din of feminine screams and a flutter of garments, and then a crashing of our pith helmets beneath the blows of pokers and endirons. The villagers, thus aroused, came at last to our rescue, and at once proceeded to patch up a compromise. This in view of the Amazonian reinforcements, who were standing by in readiness for a second onset, we were more than pleased to accept. From this inglorious combat we came off without serious injury, but with those gentle poker taps were knocked out forever all the sweet delusions of the light of the harem. The great antiquity of this Teheran-Meshed road, which is undoubtedly a section of that former commercial highway between two of the most ancient capitals in history, Nineveh and Balkh, is very graphically shown by the caravan routes at Lasgird. These have been worn in many places to a depth of 4 feet in the solid rock. It was not far beyond this point that we began to feel the force of that famous Damghan wind, so called from the city of that name. Of course, this wind was against us. In fact, throughout our Asiatic tour, easterly winds prevailed, and should we ever attempt another transcontinental spin, we would have a care to travel in the opposite direction. Our peculiar mode of travel subjected us to great extremes in our mode of living. Sometimes, indeed, it was a change almost from the sublime to the ridiculous, and vice versa, from a stable of sheepfold, with a diet of figs and bread, and an irrigating ditch for a lavatory, to a palace itself, an oriental palace, with all the delicacies of the East, and a host of servants to attend to our slightest wish. So it was at Bostam, the residence of one of Persia's most influential hakims, or governors, literally pillars of state, who was also a cousin to the Shah himself. This potentate we visited in company with an English engineer whom we met in transit at Sharood. It was on the evening before, when at supper with this gentleman in his tent, that a special messenger arrived from the governor, requesting us, as the invitation ran, to take our brightness into his presence. As we entered, the governor rose from his seat on the floor, a courtesy never shown us by a Turkish official. Even the politest of them would, just at this particular moment, be conveniently engrossed in the examination of some book or paper. His courtesy was further extended by locking up our horses and making us his prisoners until the following morning. At the dinner which Mr. Evans and we were invited to eat with His Excellency, benches had to be especially prepared, as there was nothing like a chair to be found on the premises. The governor himself took his accustomed position on the floor, with his own private dishes around him. From these he would occasionally fish out with his fingers some choice lamb kebab or cabbage dolma, and have it passed over to his guests, an act which is considered one of the highest forms of Persian hospitality. With the shifting of the scenes of travel, we stood at sunset on the summit of the Binold Mountains, overlooking the valley of the Kashafrud. Our 2 weeks' journey was almost ended, for the city of Meshed was now in view, 10 miles away. Round us were piles of little stones, to which each pious pilgrim adds his quota when first he sees the holy shrine, which we beheld shining like a ball of fire in the glow of the setting sun. While we were building our pyramid, a party of returning pilgrims greeted us with "Meshedi at last." "Not yet," we answered, for we knew that the gates of the holy city closed promptly at twilight. Yet we determined to make the attempt. On we sped, but not with the speed of the falling night. Dusk overtook us as we reached the plain. A moving form was revealed to us on the bank of the irrigating canal, which skirted the edge of the road. Backward it fell as we dashed by, and then the sound of a splash and splutter reached us as we disappeared in the darkness. On the morrow we learned that the spirit of Hassan and Hussein were seen skimming the earth in their flight toward the holy city. We reached the bridge and crossed the moat, but the gates were closed. We knocked and pounded, but a hollow echo was our only response. At last the light of a lantern illumined the crevices in the weather-beaten doors, and a weird-looking face appeared through the midway opening. "Who is there?" said a voice whose sepulchral tones might have belonged to the sexton of the Holy Tomb. "We are Ferengis," we said, "and must get into the city tonight." "That is impossible," he answered, "for the gates are locked, and the keys have been sent away to the governor's palace." With this the night air grew more chill, but another thought struck us at once. We would send a note to General Maclean, the English consul general, who was already expecting us. This our interlocutor, for a certain inam, or Persian bakshish, at length agreed to deliver. The general, as we afterward learned, sent a servant with a special request to the governor's palace. Here, without delay, a squad of horsemen was detailed and ordered with the keys to the Herat gate. The crowds in the streets, attracted by this unusual turnout at this unusual hour, followed in their wake to the scene of disturbance. There was a click of locks, the clanking of chains, and the creaking of rusty hinges. The great doors swung open, and the crowd of expectant faces received us in the holy city. Meshed claims our attention chiefly for its famous dead. In its sacred dust lie buried our old hero Harun al-Rashid, Firdusi, Persia's greatest epic poet, and the holy Imam Riza, within whose shrine every criminal may take refuge from even the Shah himself until the payment of a blood tax, or a debtor until the giving of a guarantee for debt. No infidel can enter there. Meshed was the pivotal point upon which our wheel of fortune was to turn. We were filled with no little anxiety, therefore, when, on the day after our arrival, we received an invitation to call at the Russian Consulate General. With great ceremony we were ushered into a suite of elegantly furnished rooms, and received by the Consul General and his English wife in full dress. Madame de Vlassow was radiant with smiles as she served us tea by the side of her steaming silver samovar. She could not wait for the circumlocution of diplomacy, but said, "It is all right, gentlemen. General Kuropatkin has just telegraphed permission for you to proceed to Askabad." This precipitate remark evidently disconcerted the consul, who could only nod his head and say "Oui, oui" in affirmation. This news lifted a heavy load from our minds. Our desert journey of 600 miles, therefore, had not been made in vain, and the prospect brightened for a trip through the heart of Asia. Between the rival hospitality of the Russian and English consulates, our health was now in jeopardy from excess of kindness. Among other social attentions, we received an invitation from Sahib Divan, the governor of Khorasan, who next to the Shah is the richest man in Persia. Although 76 years of age, on the day of our visit to his palace he was literally covered with diamonds and precious stones. With the photographer to the Shah as German interpreter, we spent half an hour in an interesting conversation. Among other topics, he mentioned the receipt, a few days before, of a peculiar telegram from the Shah: "Cut off the head of any one who attempts opposition to the tobacco regime." And this was followed a few days after by the inquiry, "How many heads have you taken?" A retinue of about 300 courtiers followed the governor as he walked out with feeble steps to the parade ground. Here a company of Persian cavalry was detailed to clear the field for the wonderful steel horses, which, as was said, had come from the capital in 2 days, a distance of 600 miles. The governor's extreme pleasure was afterward expressed in a special letter for our journey to the frontier. The military road, now completed between Askabad and Meshed, reveals the extreme weakness of Persia's defense against Russian aggression. Elated by her recent successes in the matter of a Russian consul at Meshed, Russia has very forcibly invited Persia to construct more than half of a road, which, in connection with the Trans-Caspian Railway, makes Khorasan almost an exclusive Russian market, and opens Persia's richest province to Russia's troops and cannon on the prospective march to Herat. At this very writing, if the telegraph speaks the truth, the Persian border province of Dergez is another cession by what the Russians are pleased to call their Persian vassal. In addition to its increasing commercial traffic, this road is patronized by many Shia devotees from the north, among whom are what the natives term the silent pilgrims. These are large stones or boulders rolled along a few feet at a time by the passers-by toward the holy city. We ourselves were employed in this pious work at the close of our first day's journey from Meshed, when we were suddenly aroused by a bantering voice behind us. Looking up, we were hailed by Stagno Navarro, the inspector of the Persian telegraph, who was employed with this back, who was employed with his men on a neighboring line. With this gentleman we spent the following night in a telegraph station, and passed a pleasant evening chatting over the wires with friends in Meshed. Kuchan, our next stopping place, lies on the almost imperceptible watershed which separates the Herat Valley from the Caspian Sea. This city, only a few months ago, was entirely destroyed by a severe earthquake. Under date of January 28, 1894, the American press reported: "The bodies of 10,000 victims of the awful disaster have already been recovered. 50,000 cattle were destroyed at the same time. The once important and beautiful city of 20,000 people is now only a scene of death, desolation, and terror." From this point to Askabad, the construction of the military highway speaks well for Russia's engineering skill. It crosses the Kopet Dag mountains over 7 distinct passes in a distance of 80 miles. This we determined to cover, if possible, in one day, inasmuch as there was no intermediate stopping place, and as we were not a little delighted by the idea of at last emerging from semi-barbarism into semi-civilization. At sunset we were scaling the fifth ridge since leaving Kuchan at daybreak, and a few minutes later rolled up before the Persian custom house in the valley below. There was no evidence of the proximity of a Russian frontier, except the extraordinary size of the tea glasses from which we slaked our intolerable thirst. During the day we had had a surfeit of cavernous gorges and commanding pinnacles, but very little water. The only copious spring we were able to find was filled at the time with the unwashed linen of a Persian traveler, who sat by, smiling in derision, as we upbraided him for his disregard of the traveling public. It was already dusk when we came in sight of the Russian custom house, a tin-roofed stone structure contrasting strongly with the Persian mud hovels we had left behind. A Russian official hailed us as we shot by, but we could not stop on the downgrade, and besides, darkness was too rapidly approaching to brook any delay. Askabad was 28 miles away, and although wearied by an extremely hard day's work, we must sleep that night, if possible, in a Russian hotel. Our pace increased with the growing darkness until at length we were going at the rate of 12 miles per hour down a narrow gorge-like valley toward the seventh and last ridge that lay between us and the desert. At 9:30 p.m. we stood upon its summit, and before us stretched the sandy wastes of Karakum, enshrouded in gloom. Thousands of feet below us the city of Askabad was ablaze with lights, shining like beacons on the shore of the desert sea. Strains of music from a Russian band stole faintly up through the darkness as we dismounted and contemplated the strange scene, until the shriek of a locomotive whistle startled us from our reveries. Across the desert, a train of the Trans-Caspian Railway was gliding smoothly along toward the city. A hearty welcome back to civilized life was given us the next evening by General Kuropatkin himself, the Governor General of Transcaspia. During the course of a dinner with him and his friends, he kindly assured us that no further recommendation was needed than the fact that we were American citizens to entitle us to travel from one end of the Russian Empire to the other. From Askabad to Samarkand there was a break in the continuity of our bicycle journey. Our Russian friends persuaded us to take advantage of the Trans-Caspian Railway, and not to hazard a journey across the dreaded Karakum sands. Such a journey, made upon the railroad track, where water and food were obtainable at regular intervals, would have entailed only a small part of the hardship incurred on the deserts in China. Yet we were more than anxious to reach, before the advent of winter, a point whence we could be assured of reaching the Pacific during the following season. Through the kindness of the railway authorities at Bokhara station, our car was side-tracked to enable us to visit, 10 miles away, the ancient city of the East. On November 6 we reached Samarkand, the ancient capital of Tamerlane, and the present terminus of the Trans-Caspian Railway. End of section 6.